Fighting Blindness Canada's Viewpoint Education Series shares the latest vision research, provides opportunities for you to ask your questions, and connect with other people who are living with a blinding eye disease. The session you're about to watch is a recording. To learn more about the research we fund and upcoming programs and events, please visit our website at fightingblindness.ca. Viewpoint is proudly supported by our presenting partner Bayer, our connections partner Roche, and our silver partners Astellas and Beacon Therapeutics. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy this session and share your thoughts with us in the comment section below.
Welcome to Dr. Aboobaker. We're really lucky to have somebody who's really working at the intersection of patient care and research, because today that's what we really want to talk about. What's happening in AMD treatment and research, what's coming quickly, maybe what is further away. So really trying to provide some clarity about these topics. And Dr. Aboobaker, he is a Vitreoretinal Surgeon and co-director of clinical research at the Toronto Retina Institute. And he cares for patients with retinal conditions, including age-related macular degeneration. And I think really importantly, he's also actively involved in a number of global clinical trials. Before we get started with our first questions, I just want to provide some grounding information about age-related macular degeneration. So we're all starting from a similar page. So AMD, or age-related macular degeneration, that affects a part of the eye called the retina, which is the light-sensing part of the eye. And in particular, AMD affects a part of the eye which is called the macula. So this is the part of the retina that's responsible for central vision, so things like reading or recognizing faces. And there are two main types of AMD. There's dry AMD and wet AMD. Dry AMD typically progresses more slowly, but it can progress to a more advanced form called geographic atrophy, which can cause significant vision loss. And then you have a type of AMD called wet AMD, which involves abnormal blood vessel growth in the eye. And if it isn't caught and treated early, this can cause more rapid vision loss. So for today's conversation, we're not going to be spending a lot of time talking about diagnosis or symptoms, and that's because we've covered a lot of these topics in previous webinars. And we also have a lot of information on our website. And so we're going to be sharing those links afterwards. But instead, as I mentioned, we'll be focusing really on treatment, on innovation, and what does this mean in practical terms. So thank you for waiting patiently, Dr. Aboobaker, as we got through that introduction. Let's begin with where things stand today. So if a patient comes to you and you diagnose them with either dry or wet AMD, like what are you suggesting for treatment? What would they expect to receive?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and thanks for having me today. I'm really happy to be here and happy to see so many attendees, and I know some of my patients had sort of said they would be attending as well. So very happy to sort of discuss this today with you. And thank you for the introduction as well. So, when we're talking about AMD, as you very well, very expertly pointed out, we're talking about two different buckets here in terms of treatment, whether that be dry AMD or wet AMD. And so when you talk about standard of care, obviously right now, the truth is that we've struggled with treating dry macular degeneration for a very long time. And so patients coming in to see us now are being advised, obviously, for the longest time to continue or start on multivitamins. The ones that have been studied the most are sort of the AREDS2 studied vitamins, and that's a specific formulation that consists of a lot of vitamins that work with antioxidants, because we do believe that there's sort of an inflammatory process that drives the dry macular degeneration. So that's been shown to slow down the effect of the disease and the progress of the disease. It's also, interestingly, in recent research, been shown that it even works in the later stages of the disease. Once you develop geographic atrophy, it actually can continue to slow down that development and progress of geographic atrophy. So that's still a cornerstone of management at this point. Another thing that we discuss is around dietary changes. So green leafy vegetables, oily fish, high in omega-3s and 6s. So you're looking at sort of the salmons, the trouts, spinach and kale. I know the kale, a lot of my patients don't love the kale, so I get that response. But as much as you can get of that into your diet, sort of 2 to 3 times a week, usually will be helpful at this stage. So as you can see from that, these are very sort of, they're not sort of technologically advanced or new sort of fancy therapies. So really we're relying on what we've discovered probably 10 or 15 years ago about the condition. And obviously today we'll be talking about some upcoming therapies, but there's not really been, unfortunately, a massive breakthrough in terms of standard of care for dry macular degeneration. On the other hand, and this is probably very well known to the audience, is the wet macular degeneration approach. And for that, we do monthly or longer if we're able to injections into the eye using a product called an anti-VEGF drug, which stands for anti-vascular endothelial growth factor. And basically what that means really is that sort of limits that growth of the blood vessel that Larissa was talking about that grows in wet macular degeneration. So that's still a cornerstone. That has worked exceptionally well. It's changed our entire field. We would watch people go blind very suddenly with this condition. And since the advent of injections, we've been able to preserve and actually even improve vision. And I've got patients getting these needles for around 12 or 13 years. So we're happy that we have it, but we're obviously always looking forward to in the future for the next big thing.
Can I ask a follow-up about the wet AMD injections? For most of your patients, will the treatments continue to work for, I know you mentioned you have some patients who are on them for up to 12 years. Is that what most patients would expect? Or for some patients, do you find that the treatments stop working or they stop responding to treatments?
So that's a great question. And I think also sort of aligned with that is some of the questions that we get is, how long will I be needing to do this treatment? Is sort of a very common question. So to answer the question, and patients obviously have concerns about ongoing needles into the eye. Is there damage to the eye by doing that? Obviously, with each needle, there's a risk of an infection. There's a risk of blindness. Thankfully, that risk is low. But to answer your question directly, Rissa, yes, we do find that the drugs seem to continue to work. There are obviously nuances to every situation. So there are some patients I find tend to fluctuate. And by that, I mean what I'm able to do, or what we're all able to do as retina specialists, is be able to extend patients out beyond that 4 weeks. And each patient has their own interval. So I know stories in the waiting room. I've kind of heard, as I step out of my room and there's a discussion where, but I'm at 16 weeks and I'm at 8 weeks and I'm at 10 weeks and why am I not there? It's really an individual response. So the drugs continue to work. There are some patients, and there is this hypothesis of something that we call tachyphylaxis, which is essentially that, as you hinted at, there's a less response over time. And I think, I don't think it, I think it exists to a small degree. I'm not too worried about that in my own practice. When I do see patients get more activity of their disease, I ask myself more, is this the disease reactivating as opposed to the drug not working as well? But having said that, we've got lots of new agents that have just come onto market within the last few years, which is exciting. And then obviously we're always looking for the next big thing to try and sort of assist and reduce that treatment burden or space the patients out longer between their injections.
And one sort of last question, again, around wet AMD, just because that's where the current treatments really are. I guess, are there anything that you would like patients to know that maybe you feel like patients don't understand about the injections, or questions you commonly get from your patients around the injections, or any common concerns they have?
Yeah, so that's a great one. So, I think the biggest fear out there and anxiety is, the mental concept of a needle in the eye. We've had horror movies showing these kind of things, so I understand where that fear sort of comes from. But obviously, this is something that we do on a daily basis. So, as long as you make sure that you're going to somebody who does regular injections, you're in good hands. Another big concern, and this again is rightly so, is regarding the pain with the needles. So obviously, sticking a needle in the eye, it's not a nerve-free sort of structure. And so you should be expecting a little bit of discomfort. Now, we have multiple ways to sort of mitigate that. And so you'll get anesthetic drops into the eye to prep the eye. At least I can speak at TRI. We do a secondary sort of freezing, which is a little injection underneath the surface layer of the eye, which really addresses the potential pain. So one of the common refrains I hear from my patients and patients that try, thankfully, is that for the most part, they don't have too much pain with their needles. So it really depends on how much anesthesia you sort of focus on. And for me, that's a priority for the patients. The next one that I mentioned is sort of regarding the length or the duration of therapy. And, until we get something different or something better, I think it's very important for everybody out there to know this is an ongoing therapy. It's similar to sort of Tylenol. If you have pain, you take the Tylenol for 4 to 6 hours. Once that's wearing off, that pain is coming back. And so with these drugs, I have to administer and inject it. So obviously you can't take it at home in a pill form. But usually at the beginning, around 4 weeks, and then obviously we figure that out and space it out over time, over a longer period of time, that drug is wearing off. And then that fluid, that blood vessel is coming back. And you really want to get that shot before you have a bleed and put down scar tissue, which can damage your vision.
Okay, thank you. That was a really great a great overview of sort of what currently is in the marketplace. So sort of moving on to the next step about, we know there are some very effective treatments for wet age-related macular degeneration. Of course, that means there is still what we call a treatment burden. Patients are having to go in regularly to get these injections, which can be sometimes painful, can be disruptive. Dry AMD, there aren't any current treatments in Canada beyond the AREDS vitamins that you mentioned. So what do you think are the most important research questions in age-related macular degeneration right now? And let's divide it up between dry and wet. You can start with either one. And maybe as you're thinking about the questions, are there any large patient challenges or frustrations that this research is trying to address?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with dry AMD. I think that's probably the smaller topic. So, at this stage, we know what dry AMD is and we know what it does, and we know the natural history. And so what we're trying to do from a research perspective, and it's really been the sort of more recent focus. There's a lot of energy and effort coming into the dry AMD space. And for patients listening in, the one thing I want to give is sort of a message of hope to say that there's so many therapies that are currently being evaluated. And so while we don't have anything just yet, there are the potential for things to come in the future. And so being able, as Larissa said, we do a lot of clinical trials at TRI, we do a lot of research. And so we're excited about that potential opportunity because, to jump ahead to patient frustrations, it's a tough call to say to patients, this disease is going to continue to damage your vision. You're going to end up losing central vision. And I don't know when that's going to be, but it could be anywhere in the next sort of 20 years. And I have nothing or very little that I can do about it at this point. So, it's patients out there we know are desperate to try and do something to slow this down, and rightly so. So what we are trying to ask as researchers and retina specialists is, how do we slow this disease down? What factors can we inject or treat or give to patients to be able to slow this down, to buy you time, to give you the best vision for the rest of your life? And for patients who've already lost vision from geographic atrophy, which is the end form of dry macular degeneration where you lose vision, the separate and sort of question there is there a way and how can we restore some of the vision or the cells that have been lost? And the good news is that there is progress on both of those fronts. And we are working to sort of get those treatments through the multiple phases of drug discovery and regulatory sort of approvals and to the market. And obviously we work a little bit in that pipeline, so we have some of that visibility. On the wet macular degeneration side, really the question touches on what you mentioned, Larissa, which is the words treatment burden. And so we know how much of a burden this is for patients, and not just patients, but also family members. And so some of our patients obviously are maybe still working, some may be retired, but they usually need somebody to bring them in. And if they aren't sort of lucky enough to have a spouse or friends who can bring them in, they're usually leaning on their kids. And it breaks my heart every time to see when I say to patients, I need to see you back in 7 weeks. They kind of look to their son or daughter in the room and need to okay it with their child before. And obviously the children are super supportive, which is so nice to see. But they're also missing days from work. They're taking sick days or medical leave days, and so it's impacting them potentially financially. It's also impacting our country financially because that's someone taken out of the economic workforce. So it has systemic impacts and implications. And so by trying to get drugs that last longer between shots, or even, I don't want to say we're not close to a cure. So I don't want to throw that word out there, but, something that lasts much longer, would really sort of impact the patients and the caregivers and the country's economy as a whole.
Thank you. There's a lot there. I just want to sort of touch on the idea of geographic atrophy and there not being any treatments right now. Do you think there's something very specific about why it has been so hard to get new treatments for geographic atrophy? For instance, is there something particularly challenging about the disease, or is it because it progresses slowly, so it's hard to prove that a treatment works. Do you have a sense of why this is?
Yeah, so a lot of this comes down to sort of what is our current understanding and how much do we know about the condition. And the truth is we do know a lot, but one thing you learn in medicine is the more you learn, the more you actually realize how much you don't know. And so, I get the sense sometimes in media circles or legal circles or when you talk to sort of non-medical people that, oh, we're in 2026, how do we not know this? And the truth is that there's a lot that we just don't know, I'm afraid. And even though we're highly specialized in our training, I think if you look, back 20 or 30 years from now, you'll think to yourself, wow, we've come a long way, we've learned so much more. So I think what we do understand at this point is we do understand what the natural history of the disease looks like. We do also understand that it's multifactorial in nature. So there's a genetic component. We understand that there may be a dietary component, that there may be an inflammatory component, and there may be other components that we just are not even aware of. We know smoking has a negative impact on this. And we're still learning and we're still, looking at new factors that are driving this. So and also, we don't really know how much it's not really sort of a perfectly linked causal relationship. And so we find sort of something that definitively sort of slows or stops the progress or causes the progress, in fact, then we can say, okay, that's somewhere we can try to focus. Now, having said that, it's not all doom and gloom. So there's a lot of work being done in sort of the inflammatory pathway to try to affect some of the body's own sort of systems that fight diseases or foreign bodies or that type of thing. And in this case, dry macular degeneration. And so, we've both said, there's no therapy in Canada, but obviously we know that there is actually an injectable treatment in the US currently. And so that hasn't reached Canada yet, but that's working on sort of trying to block some of those inflammatory pathways to try and slow down the progress of the disease.
Yeah, and I know there will probably be other questions about the treatments that are available in the States, and as you mentioned, not yet available in Canada. There is one of them that is going through Health Canada for potential approval. And FBC has sort of talked to our community members and gathered information and sort of shared that experience with the regulators to explain why we think these treatments are really important. So we're sort of hopeful that these drugs make it to Canada, but of course the main goal is to have drugs that are safe and are effective, and that's what I think everybody wants for patients. So we will keep you updated as the process goes on for that one. So Dr. Aboobaker, I'm going to sort of switch tacks a little bit and talk a bit more about some of the potential research that you're involved in, because I know that you're involved in a number of clinical trials, including global clinical trials. And I guess when you're deciding to be involved in a clinical trial, first of all, what are you looking for to take your time and sort of put your patients through what is essentially a large experiment? And what do you think patients should also know about clinical trials?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think for us, obviously, as not just retina specialists and academics, but also just to sort of see the treatment gap and the treatment need, we recognize that these are important studies and processes to sort of get new treatments approved. And I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that even the injections that people are getting these days that have really revolutionized our world, even maybe hypertensive treatments or diabetic treatments that people are taking, all of these had to undergo this sort of process to prove that they actually work.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think sometimes clinical trials get a bit of a bad rep in that, people think it's very experimental and there isn't a process. So I think one of the things I try to do is sort of educate my patients at least to say that, these processes are tested already, multiple times before they get sort of trialed in humans. Now, there is going to be somebody who's the first human to get it. There's no doubt about that. Now, in Canada, thankfully, we tend to get involved slightly later phase, which from a safety perspective and from a patient advocacy perspective is probably better for us, that we know that these have gone through phase 1 study, usually gone through phase 2 study. And so we tend to get involved around the phase 2, phase 3. So for those who aren't aware, phase 1 is sort of the first in human trials, and that really looks at safety. Is this product safe? Is it actually doing something? And the numbers tend to be very small. Phase 2, excuse me, tends to be always safety as well at this point. but also around, okay, what does the dosage look like that we're getting the maximum effect with as little drug that is needed to be used as possible. And then phase three is the one that is used to then, that's wider, that's global, and that tends to get the drug approved with the FDA and Health Canada and the European Medical Agency and elsewhere. So I think just understanding where in the process you are if you're engaging in research is important. And then you also get phase four studies, which I think sometimes gets forgotten about a little bit, is that once a drug does hit the market and we start to use it, we also want to understand as physicians and the companies that make these products as well, what impact is it having? What problems are we seeing? What is it addressing that we didn't think it was going to address? And so you may hear of, TRI, for example, or somebody else is doing a phase four study. And so these are approved therapies. So it's very much less experimental. And so I think if you're considering trials, you want to know where in the process is this. Also, what type of person are you? Are you somebody who wants to be involved in the more earlier stage? Are you somebody who wants to be involved sort of later stage? And where can we find a study that fits that kind of thinking for you? So yeah, it's a fantastic place to be, and we really enjoy sort of working at that intersection to be able to work with the next generation therapies to come.
Thank you. I can see a few questions in the chat about approvals in Canada and why does it take longer? And I'll start off the answer, and then Dr. Aboobaker, if you want to add on. So the way I think about it is most drug companies they're companies, and they need to make sure that they are ultimately making a profit. And so they tend to look at where can they get their drug approved first so that they have the biggest chance of making money. And so they're looking at the largest populations and the least levels of regulation in a way. So that is the United States, where they go through the FDA. There isn't the same level of public reimbursement in the US. So it's all based on a lot of private payers. So the US is in almost every case is going to be the first place that a drug company, a large drug company, goes to approve a medicine. Second is usually the European Medical Association, or EMA, so in Europe, because again, very large population. And then Canada tends to be in that sort of I'd say tertiary category, where you'll have like Canada, Japan, maybe the UK, Australia, Switzerland, some of those countries. And I think it's a big part of it is the just population size of Canada. We're a much smaller population, and so we sort of come in a little bit later. Some things that the government is doing to try to speed up approvals, because I think the approval process is quite complicated in Canada, is they are starting to work together with other regulatory agencies. So for instance, the UK agency or Australia or Switzerland, so that each of these countries isn't doing a fully distinct review on the same data. So I think there is efforts to speed up the process, but I think there's also a ways to go. Dr. Aboobaker, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with everything you said, and I think it's important. I think we also sort of need to recognize we do live in a capitalist environment, and I'm not sort of saying that, that should be the be all and end all. As far as I'm concerned, patient first. But these companies do put in a lot of money, like we're talking millions and millions of dollars, to try and get these drugs through the sort of development pipeline. And only 5 to 10% of assets that start early phase actually make it to market. And so, we tend to regularly sort of look at pharma as the bad guys, but they're the ones driving our field forward. And so, there does need to be a balance of sort of understanding, costs to do research, but also making sure that we are safe and effective products to our patients that are going to be life-changing, and not just sort of, chasing dollars. I think that is important. So it's a difficult balance. It's a fine balance sometimes. But everything that you said, it's about the market size. Regulatory challenges exist for sure. Thankfully, in Canada, we're in, as you said, that second or third sort of wave. So while we do tend to get things a little bit later, we're pretty high up. The nice part is we do tend to always communicate with our US colleagues, and we do tend to hear about any troubles that may brew, with new therapies. So there was an example of one recently that came to market, there were no issues, and then people started going blind. And so we heard about that. So we were kind of protected and sheltered from that a little bit, and so were our patients, thankfully. So there's pros and cons. We definitely do like to be, at the front line, cutting edge, definitely, want to be at innovations sort of leading edge. But there are some challenges that come with that as well.
I think that's a great sort of reminder too, that ultimately safety is always the most important, and there is sometimes a silver lining in not being the first to get a treatment. Talking a little bit more about clinical trials, we talked a bit about sort of the process and how important it is that the process is set up properly so that you're making sure that the treatments are safe and effective. And how do you as a researcher really determine that a treatment is working? We're talking specifically about age-related macular degeneration here. Is it largely looking at something like visual acuity, like reading letters on a chart, or are there other measures that are also important to measure?
Yeah, this is a very topical question actually as we move towards dry AMD, and I'll try and explain sort of why. So historically, absolutely, as you said, visual acuity has always been sort of the goal and the ultimate sort of biomarker or assessment, so to see if something is working. Um, we've also been very lucky and spoiled that, our treatments have led to vision improvements, and in ophthalmology, we're a vision field, so that's obviously always going to be the priority is either, trying to regain vision where we can. The challenge comes in dry macular degeneration. So the problem here is that we know that this is more of a degenerative and a slowly and chronic sort of degenerative condition that eventually does lead to loss of vision. So patients usually with early dry macular degeneration may not be suffering from significant visual impairment. I've got patients that I see once a year that are, 20/20, 20/30, for context, that's 20/20 is obviously great vision. 20/30 is still within driving vision. So, visual acuity improvements is a challenge at that stage. How much more can you get out of the eye? But if you're trying to slow it down or stop the progress, then we've got to look at sort of things that we can assess that are maybe anatomical or structural that we see in the eye, such as growth of the geographic atrophy or as it sort of grows in size. So one of the things that we had done prior to these drugs sort of coming to market was trying to understand what is the growth rate? How fast do these sort of areas grow? How quickly does it get to the center of the eye? We still don't have a model that is able to sort of tell me on a patient by patient level how long you have before it hits the center. That's another common question that I get is, yes, I have dry macular degeneration. How long before I go, oh, I've developed geographic atrophy. How long before I get blind? Or not blind, blue central vision, I should say. So we don't quite have that. So what we've done is we've sort of looked at, does this affect growth rates now? So we've tracked what is the natural history of that growth rate. Is this drug or intervention coming in below that? Or is it having, minimal impact? What are we seeing on our scans? So for patients of mine out there or any patient out there, you probably get an OCT regularly. So that's an imaging that's used to image the back of the eye, and you can see the different layers of the retina, and that's how decisions are made regarding your therapy. And so we'd look at those different layers and sort of see, what is the health of that layer? Is it slowly getting worse over time, or is it still looking pretty healthy? So we're looking at newer ways to sort of try to understand the impact of these treatments. And interestingly enough, the regulatory authorities have and are going through the same process actually as well, because they've been so reliant on visual acuity because that's all we've known in the retina space is these big improvements in visual acuity.
Yeah. So yeah, as new treatments come in, I'm trying to also make sure you've got the best way to measure the changes is going to be something that we're going to continue to be talking about, I think, in the coming years. Another maybe one or two quick questions before I turn it over to the audience. I can see there's a lot of questions coming in there. I want to make sure there's enough time. So maybe we'll end up with this one. We've talked a lot about innovation, about clinical trials. If you could talk about what could patients realistically expect in, say, the near future, let's say in the next 2 to 3 years, and then maybe a little bit more hypothetical in 5 years plus, what sort of innovations are you looking to see for your patients?
Yeah, so I'm an optimist for sure. So my answer immediately is going to be the future's never been brighter. And I know that's hard to hear, if somebody's been struggling with a condition, and we're saying there's no therapy right now. But I've never seen a time where there've been more treatments under investigation in the retina space ever. And I've been in practice now for about 8 years, but I've been in my training, probably now around sort of 18 years, probably closer to, or 15 years. So this is really an exciting time to be in retina. I think on the wet macular degeneration side, what we have sort of in terms of sightlines on the pipeline is a lot of work towards building durability and getting the drugs to last much longer. So things like devices that we can implant into the eye that slowly sort of release drug. Those are in the works. Those have been approved in the US. The numbers on there is that you need a refill every sort of 6 to 9 months at this stage. So that's quite exciting for somebody who is getting regular injections.
Mhm.
The other one that, Larissa, we've spoken about before is obviously gene therapy. And so gene therapy is it's almost science fiction. So what we do is we either inject either in the OR or in the office, depending on which one, a recipe basically that's carried by sort of viral vector. So it's the adenovirus that's been sort of scrubbed clean, if you will. So it's not really going to make you sick, but it's carrying the recipe for the drugs that we inject, and your eye just absorbs that, takes that recipe in, and starts to produce the drug. So we call it a biofactory, but really it's just the eye is becoming a drug factory essentially. And that's science fiction as far as I'm concerned. If you told me that 20 years ago, I would have thought you're talking about a movie or a novel or something like that. But now, that is imminently on the horizon. We just completed our first gene therapy trial at TRI. It was a global study. So we're waiting to get those results. We've got another one that just completed right now. And there's a third one upcoming. So that is an exciting space. Now, what is that going to offer, really, is the next question. So if the eye is producing the drug, is that a cure? And I'd be careful to say that it is. I think more what it's going to do is kind of be like if there's any diabetics out there, it'll be like your sort of long-term insulin. So
Mhm.
before we had that, people were just doing bolus shots of short-term insulin, and then long-term insulin came. So then you start getting a more physiological sort of baseline of insulin being secreted or produced, or in this case injected. And so this would give you that. So I think you'll still need injections, but you probably would need them much less frequently. So the early data we've seen from their phase 2 kind of hints at about a 90% reduction in coming in for your injection. So you're looking at maybe 1 or 2 injections a year. There are some patients, though, who've gone multiple years without needing one. So again, just be careful about expectations. Everybody individually is different, but that is very, very exciting stuff, and potentially significantly impactful. In terms of dry macular degeneration, obviously, as you said, Larissa, we're waiting on sort of regulatory approval for the anti-complement therapies is the name of it. Um, but I think in the next 5 years, I would probably expect at least one, if not two, of the pipeline of drugs that are potentially coming to sort of reach the market. So I think we may likely get into a discussion at some point with all of us with our patients around, okay, we may have an injection for your dry macular degeneration. Right now at TRI, we're involved in a study that is looking at FAS inhibition. So this is something if everybody's lost out there, don't worry. I never heard about this, 6 months ago. I was just as clueless. I had no idea what this was. But basically, this injection that's given every either 12 or 24 weeks, and we're going to figure out what the best sort of interval is over time in the study and beyond. This interrupts a death signal that is sent from the brain or the eye to the cells of your retina that are dying in geographic atrophy. So this has the potential to intercept that signal and stop or potentially even reverse dying cells and prevent healthy cells from sort of dying. And what we're seeing in early phase studies, to be fair, so don't hold too much value to that just yet, but we're seeing some vision improvement, which is impressive with that we did not expect. And we're seeing a slowing down effect in terms of the growth of geographic atrophy
Mhm.
and loss of vision. So I think it's exciting. In the next 5 years, we're going to be talking about multiple of these different products, but we're going to see which one comes to market, which one's the safest, and which one's the best. But definitely good news on the horizon potentially.
I feel like that is the perfect time for me to stop this part. We're looking to the future where potentially the problem is that there are multiple treatments that you have to have a conversation about which one is best for your patients, which I think would be a really great problem to have, actually. So, Morgan, I'm going to call you back if you are ready to join the conversation. And thank you so much, Dr. Aboobaker, for chatting with me. That was a great discussion.
Thanks, Rosa.
Well, thank you both. That was really insightful, and I learned some things. It was great. We have so many questions, so let's see how we can do getting through a lot of these questions. Again, I just want to remind everyone that we recommend you put your questions in the Q&A box that is on the bottom bar of your Zoom toolbar, or if it's easier for you, you can also email us at education@fightingblindness.ca. Again, that's education@fightingblindness.ca. Okay, so let's dive in. We've got so many questions. I'm tr going to try to group them if I can. There's a lot of questions about supplements and ARIDs. We always get a lot of questions when we have an AMD webinar about them. Um, So a couple things that people have asked, for example, is mesoxanthion important to be included in ARIDs? Um, there was another question here about someone has wet AMD but is taking ARIDs, or they're asking if they can take ARIDs to help with wet AMD. So could you talk a little bit about just generally like what are these vitamins? Why are they important? Who should be taking them?
Yeah, so I think it's important to sort of separate out what's been studied and sort of what is being sort of recommended sometimes. So, the AREDS and then AREDS 2 formulation included vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, zinc, copper, and then lutein and zeaxanthin. So that's really what's been studied. So I do get a lot of questions, what about this and what about that? And what about blueberry extract, right? That's a common one that comes up. I think there's a lot of adverts about that. And I think it's hard for us to sort of give you a direct answer other than to say that the only thing that we can really recommend is what's been studied. And so, I think if there's any doubt or concern or side effects or problems with that, I think that's when you sort of get into some of these other potential sort of options. But I think from a scientific standpoint, from the retina community, AREDS 2, if it says that on your box, you're good. And in terms of continuing to use that, so I think, this is a point that I think does need to be sort of mentioned is we have this belief, I think, and when I say we, I mean retina specialists. I think we had this belief where you had dry macular degeneration and then you convert to wet macular degeneration. And I've decided that I don't like that word, and I'll tell you why. Is that we've now sort of understood, and I sort of questioned this back then, that actually these two run in parallel. So you have dry macular degeneration, and you will always have dry macular degeneration until one day, hopefully we find a cure. But you then, on top of that, develop wet macular degeneration, and then these two run sort of simultaneously together. And we'd always have this question about why patients are losing vision while they're on the injections. And to my understanding, this is one of the reasons. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons because the atrophy, the death of cells from dry macular degeneration is not stopping. So what you also may engage in a conversation with your physician over the next few years when we get therapies for dry macular degeneration, and this may sound like a lot to take in, is you may be getting a needle for wet, and you may simultaneously or at another visit be getting a needle for dry in the future. And that's something that as physicians we are starting to sort of absorb and deal with the repercussions of the burden that's going to be on us. But as patients, I think it's super important to understand, which needle is treating which condition. As far as the AREDs are concerned, yes, you should continue to use that even if you have wet macular degeneration because your dry disease is still progressing. And it's also been shown to slow down the progress of geographic atrophy.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I think that a lot of people think it's one way or another. I think I saw another question pop up. Can you have wet in one eye and dry in one eye? And the answer, of course, is yes, that you can have these conditions in one eye, the other eye, they can happen in parallel. And that's really interesting about this, again, this increase in potential injection sort of burden. We always get a question too, and I think I saw somewhere in one of my many questions about the interactions between like glaucoma and AMD. And again, thinking about the injections and eye pressure and putting more volume into the eye, can you talk a little bit about how those two conditions interact?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a sort of contentious question amongst doctors quite a bit, actually. So I think a little bit of this goes back to what we do know versus what we don't know. So what we do know is that when you get the injection, your pressure goes up in the eye for sure. It's a closed structure, so by just basic, physics and science, you're filling up that closed structure with more fluid, and so that's going to put pressure on the eye, and so we can measure that pressure. The good news, though, is that the eye has such good compensatory mechanisms for this that we find within about 15 minutes at the longest, that pressure response does seem to settle back to where you were. So, in terms of an acute response, you may have a blackout of your vision, you may see quite blurry. In worst cases, you'll get a headache or feel nauseous. That needs attention. So, speak to your physician if that happens. But that usually settles. The question that's under contention is what does that mean long term in terms of me getting this needle, let's say every 4 or 6 weeks? for the next 10 or 20 years, or already been getting it for 10 years. Well, the truth here is that we actually don't know. So if you speak to a glaucoma specialist, they will tell you that they believe that the injections worsen the condition. If you speak to most retina specialists, we'll recognize that we're impacting the pressure in the acute phase, but we're not 100% sure if that's actually having an impact in the longer term. So one of the studies that I'm doing at the moment is looking at some of the nerve fiber layer, which is sort of the most sensitive part when it comes to glaucoma damage. And we're trying to understand, A, do we see damage over time? And then B, we're getting these drugs now with different volumes that we need to inject into the eye. Are those impacting glaucoma in the long run? So hopefully we'll get some answers from that. But the truth is, I think we don't have the full story right now.
Thank you. I like how you're breaking it down again into what we know and what we just don't know yet. And I like to hear about the research that's happening to sort of, try to answer some of those questions and probably raise more questions because that's science, right? That's how we go. I have another question while we're talking about sort of concurrent conditions about cataract surgery. People are wondering if they have surgery for cataracts, does that impact or worsen their AMD?
So this is a common one as well. And I've had a few patients who've had cataract surgery and come back and then developed wet macular degeneration. And I want to be very clear about this also, that we don't know. So there is scientific discussions around the terms correlation and causation. Correlation basically means that it's possible, and I'm never one to doubt that, but that there is a strong chance that it was just coincidence. And when we start to notice a trend, and if it's happening regularly, then we start to investigate and try to look for causation, which is a direct causal link or relationship between the two. Is it possible that your cataract surgery could cause wet macular degeneration? Anything in life is possible. I've seen patients develop wet macular degeneration after cataract surgery, but I would be very hard pressed to say it is the direct cause. And I'd be very hesitant to support anybody who said that it was from the cataract surgery. So I think, cataract surgery is generally safe. We do so much cataract surgery that the vast majority of people who have cataract surgery are usually fine after. Having said that, there will be some patients who do. And so it's important just to try and separate those two out in our heads.
Thank you. So changing directions a little bit, there's a lot of questions going on here about different sort of proposed therapies, drugs, innovation. So I just want to ask some questions about that. So by far, I've seen so many questions today to talk about Macumira specifically. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? And some people are saying they've had it. Some people are asking if they should get it. What does it do? So just an overview and some of your thoughts about that particular one would be great.
Absolutely. So this is another very hot topic right now in the field. Also another contentious one. I'm getting all the contentious questions, so I'm going to upset half the crowd and appease half the crowd. So forgive me if either way.
I put you in the hot seat.
Yeah. So anyway, so Macumira. So again, what we do know, what we don't know, good news, bad news. The good news is that this is a innovative therapy looking at microcurrent electrical stimulation. So you would get little electrodes put on your forehead. And the hypothesis is that this microcurrent stimulation would somehow, that we haven't quite figured out from a biological plausibility, as in how does this actually work or make sense, that would reduce or slow down your dry macular degeneration. And that's a treatment that's given sort of regularly. The other exciting good news is that this is actually a Canadian technology, which is, as Larissa was saying, we're always looking to the States for innovation. It's always nice to see some Canadian technology, which is great. What we also do know is there's been one study done on this. And that study was done out west in Vancouver, sort of in BC, if I'm not mistaken. But if you ask people in the retina community, we would say that there are some issues with how that study was designed, and that there was some uncertainties and sort of maybe unconvincing findings from that study. So I have personally actually been in discussions with Macumira where I've told them that, as a retina community, as a group, we also feel that this needs to be further studied. We're not opposed to the concept or the idea that there may be something here. We just have not seen it. We haven't used it, but we've not seen enough data to suggest that it is something that we want to pursue at TRI. But we have sort of opened the door to say, well, we could maybe look to study this. And as far as I understand at this point, I think there may be some work being done with the company to sort of look at a further study. Not with us at this point. There were some discussions around that, but I think we are waiting and watching to see what comes of this. And I think for right now, that would be my advice to my patients and also to the audience. Is just, I'm not saying this doesn't work, and I'm not saying it won't work, but again, we just don't know yet what it actually does and how well it does or does not work.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Macumira is a device versus a drug. So could you talk, because I know there's some questions about approval processes and that. So can you talk a little bit about how that works differently, maybe for a device versus a drug in Canada's healthcare system?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's sort of important, I think, for the audience to be aware of this. So I'm glad that you brought this up, Morgan. Um, that drug approval process that I kind of went through with the phase 1 and the phase 2 and the phase 3, and then FDA, et cetera, that is a very rigorous, very expensive, lots of patients involved, lots of analysis of imaging and visual acuity and all the other things that we do in our clinical trials, with hundreds and hundreds of sites around the world. That's been a very well-established model, and there's a lot of trust in that process. That's very different for the devices. And so I can't sort of speak to the intricacies of that. I've never sort of been too deeply involved in device development. But what I do know is that the standard that they're held to for approval is much, much lower. So it's much easier to get a device approved, much less patients, much less rigorous processes. And I know that in conversations that occur, we talk about, oh, this is an approved therapy. This is an approved therapy. It's very important, as Morgan said, to understand, is this a drug that's approved or a device? And so speak to your physician about, before you go in for any device that's approved, the standards are very, very different for those.
Thank you. That was really good. And again, I think it's important because I didn't really understand the difference between those two processes either. So until recently, so it's interesting how they go through. I have other questions again about other sort of these newer therapies or things that are coming out. So, question about what is red light therapy? Is it effective? And the same with something called photobiomodulation. Could you touch on those
Yeah.
topics?
So I think let's do the easy one because the photobiomodulation, it's actually not that easy. So I'll tell you why. So photobiomodulation, essentially what it is, it's multiple wavelengths of light that are delivered to the retina, and it's used in early macular degeneration. And the hypothesis is that they will stimulate a response within the retina to slow down the progress of the disease early. And we are looking for something like this. This is the kind of thing that we want and that we need for our patients. So it's not an injection. It's kind of almost like a laser if you've ever had a laser, but it's kind of just shining light into the eye. And the nicer thing about this is that there have been 3 more scientifically robust studies with good design, 100 patients in each study. And the first study was actually done in Toronto with Dr. Rob Devaney, which is always, again, nice to shout out Canada a little bit. But, three studies done in different geographies. So one in the US and I think one was in Europe. And the really strong thing from a scientific perspective that, all scientists will kind of agree on is if you do studies in different places and they show you the same result, that's good validation. And so what we've seen with the LightSight 1, 2, and 3 studies is an improvement of vision of one line, really was the key top line takeaway, but also a slowing down effect in terms of the disease itself and a reduction in drusen volume, which is the accumulation of a waste product that you produce in the eye, but that accumulates in macular degeneration. So that one still has some our field is still split about that. That's the part that is interesting to me. So I find that there's people still on either side of the aisle on this one. So this is still 50-50 amongst retina specialists. It's available in the US. If you look at uptake, it's kind of split. It's not had sort of deep penetration in the market. It's not every retina specialist that's doing this. There are some that are kind of still sitting on the sidelines saying, I'm not sure yet how much this actually does. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all, as physicians, have our own sort of limitations about how early stage we want to be involved in certain things. And so as a patient, it's good to find somebody who shares and aligns in that sort of philosophy with you. So as far as I'm concerned, once photobiomodulation comes to Canada, we as a group, we've already discussed this. This is definitely something that we want to be looking at to get into our practices, because we think there's a massive, massive need. And as I mentioned, patients are desperate to try and slow this down. And so, we feel there's enough science there to back that up. But your physician may have a different opinion, and that's okay. They may also just be waiting to see a little bit more evidence, and that's okay as well. The other piece of that was the red light therapy. So this one's also interesting because, again, we're open to the idea that there may be therapies we've not looked at. And so I think if you said red light therapy to some people, they would say, nonsense, don't go down that path. I think that the answer from my side is we don't have enough information. So we actually just don't know. But I'll share a little anecdote that, we saw in our practice. One of my colleagues, Dr. Nirajini Savachandran, had a patient who was getting full light body therapy. And she's done webinars with you guys, Morgan, with Fighting Blindness. You know her well. She had a patient who was getting the full light therapy. And this gentleman was very, very into it. So he was doing it regularly, consistently. He was very compliant with it. He was doing lots of hours in the day from what she told us. And she showed us the OCT images, and you could see that the waste material buildup, the drusen, had actually resolved. It had disappeared. Now, when I say that, remember a few things. That's only one story, and it's anecdotal. So please don't everybody go and rush out and buy red light therapy and sit in front of it for 24 hours for 7 days and come back to me and say it didn't work. There's a lot there that we don't know. But it does require further investigation. So we're open to the concept. But again, we just don't know that this is going to work for everybody.
I think that's the real important point there, is that, again, without sort of these larger scale trials, like, we don't know what's going to work for, again, everybody or the majority of people. So it's hard. But I mean, stories like that are very encouraging. But again, lots to be still worked out. Um, I see our time ticking down. There's so many good questions here. While we're still on the topic of sort of therapies and other sort of potential treatments, you talked about gene therapy before. There's several questions about stem cell therapy, and I know this we could have a whole webinar about stem cell therapy, but can you maybe sort of talk a little bit about high level where we're at with stem cell therapy in terms of looking at AMD?
Yeah, I'm so glad that came up, and I was hoping to bring that up at some point, but I think I maybe just got sidetracked with some other things. But so yes, so stem cells is now called cell therapy, as Morgan sort of pointed out. Um, and stem cells have had a bit of a bad rap, to be fair, as well, and not unfairly, though. I would say there was some sort of bad outcomes with stem cells in the eyes. People went blind, lost their vision. Some of that was, I won't say unregulated, but it wasn't. It was sort of not quite the same sort of model and usage that we've been using in these clinical trials and the drug development. So I think that's important to sort of consider. So what we're seeing now is not kind of what we saw sort of 8 or 10 years ago with what happened in the US, and I think it was Florida. So where we are right now is cell therapy is really potentially, it's still very early stage. So phase 1 in terms of geographic atrophy, dry, end stage dry macular degeneration. But cell therapy basically is taking a cell that has the potential to become any cell in the body, as some of you may know, and sort of trying to point it towards becoming a retinal cell, either a retina sort of photoreceptor, rhodocone, or the pigmented cell behind that. And what that has the ability to potentially do is replace and restore the cells that have already died in geographic atrophy, which is, again, science fiction and just phenomenal. There are about 8 companies that I've seen and 8 different investigational products, most of which I think are around phase 1, if I'm not mistaken. I'll just mention 2, if I may, that I've sort of been following quite closely. Eyesight RPE is one from Bangalore in India. Their phase 1 showed an improvement of 14 letters on average with this therapy. So we're talking about people entering the study who are basically navigational or worse, and count fingers vision, if that means anything to anybody out there, hand movements vision, that really can't see, that need assistance to be able to do just the basic mundane tasks of daily living. And this improvement of averaged 14 letters, I think the best patient was at 20 letters. That's about 3 lines on the chart. For any of you who've read the chart, that's 3 lines better on the chart. For somebody at that level of vision, that could be life-changing. And so this really has some exciting potential. The other company is Astellas, looking at that. That's a product that's coming to us for phase 3 study. So we're going to be involved in the phase 3 study probably later this year. So what I would encourage is people who are looking to be involved in macular degeneration trials. We have some on the go right now, as I mentioned, with the FAST inhibitor. We've also got the cell therapy coming later this year. So definitely touch base with a retina specialist who does research. Definitely articulate that you're interested potentially in clinical trials, and then there'll be a discussion about which trial is best for you and which ones would make sense. But cell therapy has actually been pushed. Some of them has been pushed from phase 1 to phase 3 because of the potential impact and a willingness to get that to market quicker to try and expedite that process. So that's something we're very excited about. It is a surgical procedure, so you do need to go to the OR and have that done. But thankfully, it's techniques we're very familiar with, and it's a fairly quick procedure, but very, very exciting, especially for patients who've lost vision
Right.
and lost some hope.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, really promising. And I think you've answered a couple of the other questions where people are asking about how to get involved in clinical studies, how can they get into trials. And I really like what you said before about, making sure the provider that you're working with is sort of aligned with you, right? Like I'm thinking about, it's RSP season and it's all about your level of risk, right? Like what do you invest in? It's the same thing with your health provider. You want to make sure that you're on the same page in terms of, you know, what opportunities are or that they're sort of willing to do and what works for you. Because again, what you said earlier, not everything is going to work for every person. So I really appreciate that. Um, okay, so let's move away from treatments for a little bit and talk a little bit more about, we're running out of time, so a little bit more about AMD specifically. In terms of symptoms, medication, current treatments. So we have a few questions about different eye injections. So someone talked about having Avastin and then being moved to Eylea. Other people are asking, like, how do you determine which one of these medications is the best for a patient? Another person saying, like, they've been having injections and now they've been told to stop injections. So you can just talk a little bit about that whole process and what you sort of your thought process is as a treating physician. Like, how do we determine these drugs? How do we know if we can stop, how often they have them, etc.?
Yeah, so lots of good questions in there. I think I'll start with the treatment one first, if I may, because I think that's the quicker answer. So I think what's important here to understand, first of all, is what is your diagnosis? So obviously, for the most of this, we've been talking about macular degeneration. Now, macular degeneration is usually an ongoing condition. And so the treatment there tends to be an ongoing treatment because of the risk of further loss of vision. The situations where treatment may be stopped is if there's so much damage and scarring that your physician maybe believes that there is no further benefit to continuing treatment. And that's a very legitimate reason to stop treatment. And so that's one instance. The second instance, sometimes we find almost that the disease kind of burns out, if you will. And so, you start to get much longer between, and then you find that, perhaps the patient, was lost during COVID, couldn't come in during COVID, for example, or, has been in hospital for a few months and then comes back and sees us. And, excuse me, there's no activity. And so there, you may take advantage, and I have done that with some patients to say, well, let's see what happens if you're comfortable to do so. I wouldn't risk a patient with good vision, but somebody who perhaps had some significant damage, you may say, well, is this something you may consider? So I think there are scenarios where AMD, it may change. Diabetes, so you can get swelling from diabetes that are also treated with injections. That's slightly different. Diabetes is an ongoing chronic condition, but again, the treatment approach from retina specialists is quite varied. So some would use something called a treat and extend regime, where you start at 4 weeks and then we try and push you further and further and further until we find a point where things start to come back. And some use what we call an as needed or PRN regime, which is basically checking the scans and injecting you only when things look bad. And so that disease, that drive is still always there. Things like vein occlusion and nearsighted blood vessel growth, like myopic CNBM, these are conditions that have less to lose by trying to stop the needles. So there was a study recently from London, Dr. Junkal and Dr. Shido looked at patients who sort of stopped vein occlusion injections. And actually about half of those patients actually recurred within the study period. And I've had lots of patients who stopped off their own accord, but with their own decision and came back and sort of then had flared up. It might be a year later, it might be 2 years later. But this all sort of shows us, A, not everybody responds the same, but mostly B, that these treatments unfortunately are sort of an ongoing thing. And then looking at the therapies, Avastin was the first one. It was, a stomach cancer sort of treatment, and Phil Rosenfeld took it and decided to sort of inject it into the eye, changed, this entire field about 15 or 16 or 18 years ago now. And that is still, it's an off-label use even to this day, but that shouldn't be a concern. Billions of doses, millions of doses have been given of that around the world. And it works. It just doesn't work as long as the newer therapies. So things like Lucentis have come and gone. There's now biosimilars for Lucentis, or for ranibizumab, I should say. Eylea is sort of aflibercept is the name, and that's sort of built on the Avastin and the Lucentis. And we found that patients with Eylea were going longer. And now, I guess the new thing that some of you may have heard of, or even been presented with the option with, is that there's two sort of second generation anti-VEGF drugs that have come to market in the last few years. One of them is Vabysmo, and the other one is Eylea high dose, which is essentially an 8 milligram dose of the 2 milligram Eylea that we used to be using. So both of those are promising longer sort of durability, better durability, and longer intervals between the injections. And we are seeing that in real world practice and clinical practice. So these are being developed now more to sort of address the treatment burden and bringing patients in less frequently than our sort of first generation products. None of them are bad products. They were, phenomenal and life-changing and field-changing. So these are all good products. I don't think you're in a bad hand no matter what you get. Obviously, there's nuances to each of those that your physician will go through with you, and some people may need a newer agent, whereas somebody on an older agent is doing just fine, and there's nothing wrong with that.
On that same sort of vein, there's people asking about the drugs. We were talking just now about the wet AMD drugs, the injections. So there's someone asking about sort of the dry AMD injections that we know are currently now available in the US, but not yet available in Canada. And they're asking, can Canadians access that drug if they go to the States? Is it more advisable to wait? I do know that there are some people that do go down south for the treatment. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a little story for that actually. So I had a patient who came to me and was insistent that this is something that they wanted to do. And we looked into options for this. So I've actually had some experience with this. So obviously one option, as you mentioned, Morgan, I don't know if I should say the easy one, but an option, I guess, is to fly down south, find a physician there and pay out of pocket to get this done. Now, there's a couple of things with this. One is it's a very expensive treatment. So I don't have the exact numbers, but my understanding is that it's around $2,200 per injection. The study on this looked at patients getting this injection every 4 weeks. And then in the second year, they looked at every 8 weeks. So the label or the recommendation at this point is that you get it somewhere between every 4 to 8 weeks. So let's say you did 8 weeks, you're looking at 6 injections a year. So you can see that the costs add up quite quickly. That's just for the drug. You've got to take into account flights, accommodation, as well as the doctor's fees and the imaging fees to get all of this done. So that's going to be quite a pretty penny. Now, obviously, there are people who can afford that, and that's fantastic. And if that's the option, that's great. That patient of mine. So what we did is we applied for special access. So Health Canada has this program where you can apply for special access for a drug that is approved elsewhere that you would like or a patient would like. And we had long chats about the risks and benefits, and as well as the cost. There is a cost to consider here, and they were pretty determined. So we went down this pathway. I then subsequently found out that my patient was the second one in Canada to get this through this pathway. There was one again out west. They are having to pay out of pocket for the drug, and it is very expensive. They've also got to pay the courier fees to get it up here, and so we do little batches of 3. But she comes in every 2 months. We give her the injection. It's too early to tell about the impact of that, but if you were very determined for that, there is that pathway. I will say that review with Health Canada on that drug has been in process now for quite a while. And there has been some engagement back and forth with the company and Health Canada. So we've heard that, there is some progress being made. But as to when exactly that's going to happen, anybody's guess is probably best there. But I would say, I don't think this is too far away. So don't be too disheartened. I think it might come fairly soon. Now, the next question is, coverage and reimbursement. What does that look like from the provincial governments and insurances? Because obviously this is going to be quite expensive.
And that process, of course, will take time as well. Yeah. So we have a couple questions about, again, just sort of, I guess, for example, this question was, can you have dry? We talked a little bit about this, but I think the difference is, can you have dry or wet in one eye and nothing in the other eye, or are both eyes always going to be affected?
Yeah, so it is by sort of almost by definition a bilateral condition, and that means obviously it's in both eyes. Having said that, I have seen patients where it's been early stage and asymmetric, so
Mm.
not quite as advanced, or very early in one eye and I don't see signs on the other eye. But I think over time we've kind of seen that that would eventually sort of develop. So there's definitely sort of a systemic issue driving this, or a factor driving this, that does affect both eyes. If you are one of the very few who only have it in one eye, great. Obviously, we've got to consider other diagnoses, sorry, in that point. But obviously, if we can preserve the one eye, we're very happy for that patient to only need to follow the one eye.
That's great. And then the last question, I'm not sure. So the question was, will we all develop wet AMD? And I'm not sure if she means all of us or everyone with dry AMD, but sort of what is the likelihood of developing the wet AMD?
Yeah. So the studies have shown that about 10 to 15% of patients with dry AMD develop wet AMD. So it's not a guarantee, number one. Um, but there is a proportion, so say 1 in 10, 1 in 6 to 1 in 10, I guess, 1 in 7 maybe. Um, but I think even if you don't, I think the important message also is that remember that dry macular degeneration is not benign. A lot of these patients have come to us and we said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. Go see your optometrist, 5, 10 years ago. That doesn't mean that condition is benign. It just means we don't have any treatment for it. So, as we get into an era where there is treatment, you definitely want to be trying to re-engage with a retina specialist to see what's available and what would work for you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Aboobaker.